Some memories stay bright forever, frozen in place like photographs that never fade. For me, it's the memory of Claire calling me from her back porch, voice trembling but proud. We finally saved enough. We're going to tell her tonight. Claire and I have been best friends since high school. I watched her fall in love with Mike, marry him, and then proceed to build a life with 5 loud, beautiful, chaotic children in a city where no one can afford anything anymore. They rented a run-down 4-bedroom house for $400 a week. Cheap by today's standards, but back then it was still considered steep. And the house, well, it had seen better decades. The drains smelled like something died inside the walls. The kitchen was a relic from the 70s and the wallpaper peeled like old skin. Still, it was home. They made it work, as people like Claire always do. The only reason they hadn't been priced out of the city was because of Margaret, their elderly landlord. Margaret was wealthy in the kind of old money way that doesn't come with arrogance. She was soft-spoken, sharp-witted, and unusually generous. Over the years, she'd made a habit of quietly helping people. She owned dozens of properties but saw tenants as humans, not numbers on a spreadsheet. She liked Claire a lot. So much so that 5 years earlier she told Claire and Mike they could buy the house one day, once they had the money. No rush. No pressure. She froze the rent where it was and told them to save. "When you're ready," she said with a gentle smile, "it's yours." And they believed her. We all did. They clipped coupons, skipped takeout. Claire took side gigs tutoring. Mike sold his tools when things got tight. 5 years of sacrifice. No vacations. No new shoes unless absolutely necessary. Every cent went into savings. Because they trusted Margaret. And because that old house wasn't just wood and bricks to them. It was safety. It was future. The night Claire told me they were ready, we sat under a string of fairy lights in her backyard with a bottle of cheap wine between us. She was glowing. "She's going to be so proud," Claire whispered. "She kept her promise. Now we get to keep ours." And 2 days later, Margaret died. Just like that. No warning. No goodbye. No paperwork. Claire got the call on a Thursday morning. I remember it because I was halfway through brushing my teeth when she rang. Her voice was hollow. "She's gone," she said, "before we signed anything." I didn't know what to say. Neither did she. The next few days were a blur of grief and worry. Claire went to the funeral, stood quietly in the back, and watched as Margaret's 4 adult children stood in expensive black coats, dry-eyed and distracted. They didn't look at her. Not once. And when the service was over, they got in separate black cars and drove away without a word. I watched from my car parked down the street. Claire sat in the passenger seat next to me, still in her dress. Her knuckles were white from clutching the clutch of her purse. "They don't even care," she said. They looked at her casket like it was a business meeting. And I knew right then. The house, the promise, was gone. It didn't take long for the children to make themselves known. Margaret's passing had barely cooled before letters started arriving in the mailbox. One from a lawyer. Another from an agency Claire had never heard of. Official tone, stiff language. The kind that tries to sound polite but is really just cold. Then came the phone call. Claire answered on speaker while I sat next to her at the kitchen table. I could hear the voice, one of the sons, I assumed. He introduced himself as Matthew, and went on to assure her that everything would be handled in an orderly fashion. He said they were working through probate, and until that process finished, nothing could be signed, agreed, or transferred. "But," he added, "we understand our mother had a long-term tenant in the property, and we'd like to honor the arrangement, in spirit at least." That phrase, "in spirit," it crawled under my skin and lodged itself like a splinter. Claire tried to stay hopeful. "That means they're still selling, right?" she said after she hung up. "They didn't say no." "No," I agreed, "but they didn't say yes either. That's not a promise. That's a stall." Weeks passed. Then months. Probate is a slow, bureaucratic monster that crawls through paperwork like molasses. Claire kept paying her rent like clockwork. They stayed patient. They stayed respectful. And finally, after nearly half a year, the process was complete. Claire received an email. "We are now able to proceed with the sale. Please confirm your loan status and we will prepare documentation." She screamed when she read it. I was there. She hugged me so tightly I almost dropped my coffee. "It's happening," she whispered. "We're getting our home." They went to the bank that same day. All the prep had been done long ago. Paperwork, credit scores, income statements. Their original loan amount had been approved months earlier. It should have been routine. But then the bank said no. Because the house was now listed as $80,000 more than expected. Claire thought it was a mistake. "It's not," the mortgage advisor said. "The vendor increased the asking price." We were stunned. Claire emailed Matthew that night asking what happened. His reply came quickly, coldly. "Following a reevaluation of the property value, the asking price has been adjusted to reflect market conditions. If you are still interested in purchasing, you are welcome to submit a formal offer by the end of the week. We plan to open the property to the public this Saturday." Just like that. They raised the price without telling her. After 5 years of promises. After being told to wait. After trusting the system. Claire stared at her laptop in silence for a full 5 minutes. Mike was pacing in the backyard, hands on his hips, looking like he wanted to punch a hole through the sky. That night I watched Claire cry on the living room floor. "This was supposed to be ours," she whispered. She wanted it to be ours. I sat down next to her. Quiet for a while. Then I asked one question. "If we had just one chance to change this, would you let me try?" She looked at me, eyes still wet. "You mean fight back?" I nodded. She didn't answer right away. But the next morning she called me and said, "Do whatever you have to do. There are people who get mad and yell. There are people who cry, who crumble, who hope for karma to take care of it. And then, there are people like me. I don't wait for karma. I build it." So when Claire gave me the green light to do whatever I had to, I sat down with my notebook and started a list. Not a list of crimes. I'm not reckless. I wasn't about to break windows or slash tires. No, I had something better in mind. Real estate agents are predators dressed like professionals. They want 3 things: clean lines, nice smells, and a fantasy that makes a potential buyer say, "I can see myself here." If I could ruin even one of those pillars, without causing actual damage, we could sink this open house faster than they could list it. And I knew just how to do it. Step 1. Disarm the house. Make it ugly, claustrophobic, and deeply undesirable. Step 2. Turn the street into a living nightmare, just for one day. I called Claire and told her to meet me at the house the next morning. She sounded hesitant. "You're sure this won't backfire?" "I promise," I said. "By the time they try to sell this house, it'll look like the least attractive property on the block." She was silent for a moment. Then, "Okay, I'm in." We started with the layout. Clean houses sell. Spacious rooms feel expensive. We flipped that on its head. We dragged every single piece of furniture 2 feet away from the walls. Pushed chairs into corners. Added an old metal filing cabinet that Mike's brother had in his shed. It was dented and loud every time it opened. Then we lined the walls with random knickknacks. Motorcycle posters, dusty trophies from high school rugby, and a taxidermied fish that Mike swore had been in his dad's attic since 1998. It wasn't messy. It was weird. Cluttered, suffocating, and slightly confusing. I made sure to scatter a few children's toys in the most inconvenient spots. Not in a charming way, but in a way that screamed chaos. Blocks underfoot. Marker stains on a coffee table. A half-built Lego set with missing pieces. The next layer was smell. Most people try to sell a house with the scent of vanilla candles or fresh baking. We went the opposite route. First, I asked Claire to boil a cabbage on the stove for 3 hours straight. The smell? Sour, thick, and heavy. Then we cracked a dozen eggs and let them sit in the sun for 2 days before dumping them down the drain. I don't regret it, even if the plumber glared at me a week later when he had to flush the lines. For the final touch, we spritzed diluted ammonia near the front door. The result? A welcome mat that smelled like a cat shelter during a heat wave. Now for the neighborhood. We dragged a moldy old couch from across the street, our neighbor's contribution to the cause, and dumped it right in the front yard. It sagged in the middle and was dotted with what I hoped was old ketchup. A few empty beer bottles on the porch sealed the look. The aesthetic? somewhere between urban decay and student housing disaster. But we weren't done. I picked up the phone and started calling in favors. Friends with loud cars were told to make errands down our street at precisely noon on open house day. Extra points if their mufflers were shot. I texted, "You'll be fed, watered, and immortalized as a hero." Next, I contacted my old rugby club. Not the team itself, but the guys who still showed up to watch games and drink like it was 1999. Big guys. Loud. Intimidating if you didn't know them. We promised barbecue and cheap beer if they showed up in full biker gear and hung around during the open house. Claire's next-door neighbor agreed to host it in their yard. Grill, music, drinks. An entire scene just next door. It didn't have to be dangerous. Just intense. Overwhelming. Chaotic. Exactly the kind of thing that makes potential buyers pause and ask, do we really want to raise our kids next to this? By the time Friday rolled around, the house looked like a Craigslist reject. The air reeked. The street was ready. The boys were prepped. Claire and Mike watched it all unfold with a kind of wide-eyed awe. "This is either brilliant," Mike said, holding a beer and glancing at the sagging couch, "or completely unhinged." Claire smiled. "Can't it be both?" We all laughed. But under that laugh I felt it, deep, hot and real. Righteous fury. Because people like Margaret's kids think they own the world. They hide behind paperwork and smiles and polite emails while stepping over people like Claire. But we were about to remind them that not everything goes according to their plans. They had money. We had community. And in less than 24 hours, we'd see which one really wins. Saturday morning was hot. The kind of heat that makes the pavement shimmer and makes you question your wardrobe choices. But it was perfect. I arrived at Claire's house around 9 a.m., dressed in jeans and a tank top, hair pulled back, clipboard in hand. Claire was already in action. The cabbage had been boiling since dawn, the curtains were drawn to make the rooms feel smaller, and she was carefully misplacing laundry in the hallway. Mike, bless his soul, was outside with the neighbor setting up the grill. The moldy couch was still there, now joined by a sagging recliner and a plastic chair with a missing leg. The place looked like a front yard from a low-budget sitcom. By 10:30, the street started to shift. First came the boys from the rugby club. They rumbled in on motorcycles, all boots and leather and shaved heads. One of them had a speaker strapped to the back of his bike and started blasting 90s grunge the second he parked. Then came the cars. Old, rattling sedans, rusty hatchbacks, a few loud trucks. One guy, bless him, had backfiring exhaust that made children flinch 2 blocks away. They circled the block like vultures, slow, heavy, and noisy. I had never been prouder. By 11 o'clock, it looked like a scene from a weird indie film. A full-blown, beer-sipping, meat-smoking, motorcycle-rattling party. And right in the middle of it, an open house with crisp white flyers and a hopeful little "for sale" sign on the lawn. The agent showed up at 11:15. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in business casual, clearly expecting a quiet viewing with maybe 5 polite couples. Instead, he stepped out of his car into what can only be described as chaos. He hesitated. I saw it. His eyes swept the street, the lawn, the neighbors, the smoke, the guys cracking beers at 11 a.m. His jaw tensed. But he walked up the driveway like he had something to prove. That was his first mistake. Claire answered the door, smiling sweetly despite the cabbage fumes wafting from the kitchen. The agent stepped inside and froze. There were 6 children in the living room watching cartoons at full volume. Every piece of furniture was blocking the flow of the room. The walls were covered in dark wallpaper, lit by one dim bulb in the ceiling. The air was thick. "Welcome," Claire said brightly. "Would you like some tea?" He declined, politely. The first prospective buyer arrived shortly after. A woman in heels and a silk blouse, looking like she was ready to redecorate before she even crossed the threshold. She parked 2 houses down, but when she saw the crowd of bikers next door, she paused. Then she saw one of the guys doing curls with a 6-pack of beer and decided to stay in her car for a few minutes. I watched her watch the chaos, and then slowly back her car out and drive away. Didn't even make it to the door. One down. Another couple showed up 20 minutes later. They were brave. Made it inside. Toured the kitchen. even nodded politely when Mike mentioned that sometimes the drains gurgle at night. I added helpfully, could be tree roots. Or spirits. You never know. They left after 7 minutes. Didn't even check the backyard. The funniest part was when one guy did try to start a conversation. He asked one of our biker friends if these gatherings were common. Oh yeah, the guy grinned. Couple times a month. Sometimes more. You know how it is, community vibes, after parties, live music. And the noise? The buyer asked, clearly uneasy. The guy shrugged. It dies down by 3 a.m. Most nights. That guy left so fast he tripped on the porch step. By 1 p.m. the party was in full swing. Kids were running around the lawn with juice boxes, the grill was spitting fat onto the concrete, and the house smelled like boiled vegetables and old mop water. It was without question the most unsellable environment you could create without calling in wild animals. And it worked. No offers. No second looks. Just a pile of ignored flyers and a very, very stressed out agent who left with a forced smile and the defeated walk of a man who knew his day was wasted. Claire stood beside me on the porch watching him go. That was a lot, she said. I grinned. Exactly what it needed to be. She looked at me, eyes full of gratitude and disbelief. I still can't believe we did that. You didn't, I corrected. We did. You had your army. You just never realized it until now. He hugged me. Smelled like smoke and cabbage. I didn't even mind. Because the war wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about proving to people like Margaret's kids that money doesn't buy everything. And that when the community rises, greed burns out fast. We didn't sleep much that night. Not because we were afraid. Not anymore. But because we were waiting. Waiting for the email, the call, the text, any sign that the siblings or their slick real estate guy had finally realized what we'd done. And what they'd lost. It came the next morning just after 9 a.m. Claire's phone buzzed. It was an email. One line. We are prepared to proceed with your original offer. Please contact us to formalize the agreement. She screamed. Mike dropped his mug. I laughed so hard I cried. The message didn't mention the open house, the bikers, or the smell of cabbage that probably still haunted the agent's suit jacket. But the meaning was clear. They'd been cornered. No one else had bid. No one else was going to. And the only offer they had, the only escape, was the one they tried to erase. They had to accept it. Because in our country, there's a little thing called anti-gazumping legislation. It's not flashy. It doesn't get headlines. But it works. Gazumping, for those lucky enough not to know, is when a seller accepts an offer, only to ditch it when a higher one comes along, leaving the original buyer stranded. It's the rich man's bait and switch. But in our jurisdiction, once you accept and sign a contract of sale, you're locked in. A better offer means nothing if the first one has already been processed. And Claire's offer? It was in the agent's hands before the last biker had even finished his hot dog. When another buyer tried to swoop in the next day, offering $30,000 more, they couldn't do a thing about it. Not legally. Not quietly. Claire's contract had already been accepted. Deposit paid. Paperwork filed. And when that offer came in, I imagined Matthew and his siblings sitting in a boardroom somewhere, faces contorted in corporate rage, realizing they'd lost tens of thousands to what they probably thought were a couple of renters with no power. But power comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a lawyer. Sometimes it's leverage. And sometimes, it's a party full of bikers and a cabbage stew. The day Claire signed the final paperwork, she wore a red blazer I'd never seen before. It made her look sharp. Unbreakable. Like someone who had seen hell and walked out with the deed in her hand. The signing took less than an hour. The agent didn't speak much. He looked like he'd aged 5 years since the open house. At one point he tried to offer Claire a coffee. She declined with a smile. Afterward we stood in the parking lot, sun on our faces, car keys in her palm. "You did it," I said. "No," she replied. "We did. You fought for us. When we didn't know how." I shrugged. "You would have figured it out." She shook her head. "No. You turned chaos into a plan. You gave us time. You reminded us that we weren't powerless. Her voice trembled just a little. Not with fear. With pride. I didn't say anything. Just hugged her. And then, something unexpected happened. One of Margaret's daughters sent Claire a letter. It arrived 2 weeks after the sale. A single envelope, no return address, but the handwriting was elegant. Familiar. Inside was a card. Blank except for a handwritten message. Our mother trusted you for a reason. I'm sorry we didn't. You earned this house. Take good care of it. Claire read it 3 times. Then passed it to me. She was the quiet one, Claire whispered. Didn't say a word at the funeral. I thought she didn't care. Maybe she did. Maybe that letter was guilt. Maybe it was an olive branch. Maybe it was an apology written too late. But Claire smiled anyway. I'll take care of it, she said softly. Every inch of it. Back at the house we started taking things down. The motorcycle posters. The moldy couch. The ammonia-scented mats. We opened the windows and let the sunlight in. A new chapter had started. And it smelled like lemon-scented cleaner and fresh paint. The kids planted flowers. Mike patched the gate. Claire bought a bookshelf she'd been eyeing for years but never felt like she could justify. This was their house now. Bought. Fought for. And no one was ever going to take that from them again. You think you're doing it for them at first. For your friend. For her kids. For the promise that got ripped away by paper, lawyers, and greedy heirs. That's what drives you in the beginning. But somewhere along the line it changes. And you realize, you're not just fighting for them anymore. You're fighting for the version of yourself that always stayed quiet. For the times you let things go because it wasn't worth the drama. For the moments you didn't speak up when you should have. For the people who took advantage of your silence. This fight, Claire's fight, became my reckoning too. And by the end of it, I wasn't the same woman who sat beside her in that backyard 5 years ago, sipping wine and talking about dreams that were just a little out of reach. Because now I reach. It wasn't like I woke up the next day with a new personality. The transformation was quiet, came in moments stacked like bricks. It came the morning I found myself standing toe-to-toe with a real estate agent, staring him down without flinching. It came when I sprayed ammonia on Claire's porch without a second thought. It came when I organized an entire street's worth of chaos and didn't feel guilty once. There was a power in it. Not violence. Not aggression. But strategy. Knowing the rules. Twisting them just enough to make them snap back in your favor. Using kindness as a disguise. Letting others underestimate you. And then winning. That's what changed me. I stopped apologizing for being sharp. People started treating me differently after that. Maybe it was subtle. A longer pause before interrupting me. A certain caution in their tone when they asked me for a favor. Even my coworkers started phrasing requests more like suggestions. I liked it. Because for the first time in my life, people didn't just hear me. They listened. Claire noticed it too. One evening after dinner she said, "You know what scares me?" I raised an eyebrow. What? You're so calm now. Like, nothing could shake you. I smiled. It's not calm. It's clarity. Same thing. She wasn't wrong. I also started sleeping better. Which sounds silly maybe, but I used to lie awake at night rerunning old conversations. Regretting things I didn't say. Worrying about what might go wrong. That inner voice that always whispered, "What if you're not doing enough?" After we won the house back, that voice got quieter. Because I had proof now. Proof that when the time came I would act. That when someone tried to hurt someone I loved, I wouldn't freeze. I wouldn't retreat. I would respond. And I would win. I think we all have a line. A point where we stop trying to be liked and start trying to be respected. That line comes at different times for different people. For me, it came with the stench of rotting eggs and a biker party next to an open house. Not exactly poetic. But it was perfect. Because it reminded me that revenge doesn't have to be cruel to be powerful. It can be funny, clever, and it can change you. Not into someone cold, but someone unshakable. Claire once told me, "You've always been strong. You just didn't know it." Maybe that's true. But now I do know. And that makes all the difference. For the next few weeks, things were quiet. Too quiet. The chaos had passed, the contract was signed, and Claire's house was officially hers. On the surface, everything was back to normal. Kids went to school, Mike mowed the lawn, I went back to work. But under the calm, there was a new kind of tension in the neighborhood. Not angry. His cause. Because word had spread. Not everyone knew the full story, of course. But gossip is a fast little beast, and this was the kind of tale that sticks to people's tongues. A quiet family, an open house turned circus. A sale nobody else touched. People talked. And I knew exactly what they were saying. She went too far. Did you hear what they did? Smelled like a landfill in there. That woman, Claire's friend, she planned the whole thing. I heard she hired bikers. I mean, they got the house, but at what cost? I didn't blame them. This city is full of people who think playing nice is the only way to survive. Smile, nod, pay your rent, don't rock the boat. If someone steps on your throat, ask them politely to step off. Don't scream. Don't fight. And then we came along, me, Claire, Mike, the kids, and the entire rugby team, and we burned that script. So yeah, people were nervous. But some of them weren't. It started with Mrs. Gallagher, the older widow 3 doors down. She stopped me on the sidewalk one morning while I was walking my dog. I braced myself for the usual passive-aggressive comment. Instead, she said, "You did good. Most people wouldn't have dared." I blinked. "Excuse me." She leaned in a little as if telling me a secret. "When my husband died, my landlord tried to double my rent. Told me it's just business. I wish I'd had someone like you back then." Then she walked away. No further explanation. Just respect. It hit me harder than I expected. Others followed. The single dad from across the street offered to help fix Claire's fence. Said it was the least he could do. I wasn't sure what he meant, but then he added, "You scared the hell out of them, didn't you?" I smiled. "Only a little." He winked. "Sometimes people need to be scared." It was like pulling back a curtain and finding out everyone had been waiting, just waiting, for someone to show them that it was possible. That the people who held the power weren't untouchable. That their rules could be bent too. I wasn't the neighborhood villain. I was just the first person to stop pretending. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. There was one woman, Rebecca I think, who made a point of avoiding eye contact whenever I passed. Her husband once mumbled something about playing dirty, while we were both in line at the post office. I didn't reply. Because I didn't need to. I wasn't here to make everyone comfortable. I wasn't doing this for applause. I did it for Claire. I did it because it was right. And if people wanted to twist that into something ugly, let them. Let them whisper. Let them squirm. Let them wonder if they might be next. Power doesn't always come from title deeds or trust funds. Sometimes it comes from the woman who stops smiling. The one who stops shrinking. The one who walks down the street with her head high, not because she's above anyone, but because she knows exactly what she's capable of. That woman. That's me now. And no one forgets the day they met her. It came slowly at first, barely noticeable. A longer pause in conversation when I entered a room. A change in tone when someone addressed me. A touch more deference than before. It wasn't respect. Not quite. It was something quieter. Sharper. It was fear. And I wasn't sure how I felt about it. There was a moment, a single subtle moment, that brought it all into focus. I was at the grocery store picking out tomatoes when I heard 2 women whispering in the next aisle. I heard she orchestrated the whole thing. Planned every detail. The one with the red blazer? Yep. Like, she burned them legally. The second woman lowered her voice. I wouldn't want to cross her. I didn't say anything, just kept picking tomatoes. But inside, a strange shiver ran through me. They weren't lying, but they weren't cheering either. I sat with that feeling for days. There's something dangerously seductive about being feared. especially when you've spent most of your life underestimated. There's a rush in watching someone shift uncomfortably under your gaze, in knowing that if you raised your voice just slightly, people would listen. I had power now. Real power. Not because I shouted the loudest, but because I had shown what I could do when someone drew blood first. And that's the part that scared me the most. Because if you're not careful, power stops being a tool. It becomes an addiction. Claire noticed the shift in me before I did. We were in her backyard watching her kids play with a sprinkler. It was a warm afternoon. Light breeze, laughter, the scent of freshly cut grass. A perfect scene. But I wasn't really present. "You okay?" she asked. I looked up. "Yeah. Why?" "You've been intense lately." I smirked. "Haven't I always been?" She smiled but didn't laugh. "No. You've always been strong. But lately, you seem like you're carrying something." I exhaled. Sat back. "Maybe I am." She didn't press. Just handed me a cold glass of lemonade and let the silence sit between us like an old friend. That's why I love her. She never needed me to explain. She just reminded me who I was before the fire started. I started pulling back just a little. Not from the strength. I wasn't about to go soft again. But I reminded myself why I fought in the first place. It wasn't to be feared. It wasn't to dominate. It was to protect. To draw a line no one could cross again. There's a line between justice and cruelty. Between defense and punishment. And when you've tasted victory, it's easy to start swinging before you even see a threat. But that's not who I want to be. I want people to think twice before trying to take advantage of someone. I want them to remember what happened on that street, in that house, when a greedy family tried to bury a promise. But I don't want them to flinch when I walk into a room. That's not power. That's loneliness. So I started smiling again. Not the empty kind. Not the "don't worry, I'll stay quiet" kind. The real kind. The kind that says, "I'm still here. I see you. But don't test me." And it worked. The tension in the neighborhood faded. The whispers stopped. People began speaking to me like a person again, not a threat. Because I had found the balance. Strong, but not cruel. Wise, but not distant. Unshakable, but still human. And I realized something important. You don't have to scream to be powerful. You don't have to burn everything down. Sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most cards. You just have to show people what you're willing to do for the ones you love. Once. That's all it takes. And then they remember you. Forever. It didn't happen all at once. The transformation was slow. Quiet even. No grand reveal. No trumpet fanfare or ribbons across the door. But little by little, the house that had been a battleground became a home again. Claire started with the front garden. She tore out the dying hedges and weeds and replaced them with flowers her kids picked out. Sunflowers, violets, marigolds. She didn't care if the colors clashed. "It's our mess now," she said with a smile. Mike fixed the front gate. Replaced the hinge. Painted it deep blue. The door got a fresh coat too. Sunset orange. Bold, unexpected, warm. Claire said she wanted people to feel welcome before they even knocked. And for the first time since Margaret's death, laughter returned to the kitchen. The living room was next. The posters came down. The mismatched furniture was replaced with second-hand finds that actually fit the space. The peeling wallpaper was scraped off inch by inch. Every child helped, hands sticky with glue and paint and pride. I came by one afternoon to find them all sitting on the floor, surrounded by snacks, watching a movie on a mattress they hadn't gotten around to moving yet. The lights were off. The air smelled like popcorn and lemon cleaner. It was perfect. No polished marble countertops. No designer lighting. But you could feel it, that warmth, that safety. A house that had been threatened, bought, fought for, now pulsed with life again. Claire cried the day the mortgage went through. Not because of the numbers or the paperwork, but because it meant they were done. No more waiting for a call. No more begging banks for mercy. No more sleepless nights wondering if someone would snatch it all away again. She told me later, "It finally feels real. Like I can breathe inside my own walls." That hit me harder than I expected. Because breathing freely isn't something we think about until it's taken from us. And for 5 years they had held their breath, living in a house that might never be theirs, trusting a promise that never made it to paper. Now the walls echoed with music and soft footsteps and the occasional argument about whose turn it was to do dishes. Life. Honest, ordinary, beautiful life. I started visiting more often after the sale was final. Not as a soldier or strategist, just as me. We sat on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the kids chase each other barefoot through the yard. No more 1 week to eviction deadlines. No more stalling lawyers. No more pit in my stomach every time the phone rang. Once Claire looked over and said, "I don't think I've ever seen you this relaxed." I laughed. Maybe I finally believe it's over. "It is," she said, "because you made it be." I didn't reply. I didn't have to. People started noticing. Neighbors slowed down when they passed, smiling at the sunflowers. One of the women who had once whispered about us brought over a tray of cookies. Even the real estate agent, who I'd secretly dubbed the Weasel, sent an awkward congratulatory card through the mail. We kept it. Framed it. It hangs above the new bookshelf, right next to a family photo where everyone's laughing and slightly out of focus. A trophy. Proof that we weren't just tenants anymore. We were owners. And every time I visited, I remembered what we almost lost. What they tried to take. What they would have taken if we hadn't fought. It wasn't just a house. It was roots. Memory. A place for birthdays and scraped knees and quiet evenings. A shelter from storms both outside and in. Now it was untouchable. Because no matter who comes knocking, no matter what market turns or contracts shift, this house has a shield around it. One built with stubbornness, strategy, and more than a little righteous fury. 15 years later, I still drive past the house sometimes. It's barely recognizable now. The paint's been refreshed again, mint green this time, with a white picket fence they installed themselves. The garden is twice as big, the flowers riotous in spring. There's a tree house in the backyard now, built by Mike and his 2 youngest kids who are teenagers now. It leans slightly, but it's filled with memory. And every time I see it, I smile. Because I remember when it nearly slipped away. The truth is, I didn't think I had that kind of fight in me. I wasn't the type to plot or sabotage or boil cabbage in defiance. But when it was Claire, when it was her family, I didn't hesitate. Because sometimes the fight chooses you. You don't go looking for a battle. But when injustice comes knocking, you find out what you're made of. You discover that you're not just a friend. You're a wall, a shield, a storm in a cardigan. And that's what I became. It wasn't just about money. It never was. Yes, those landlords wanted more than they needed, more than they earned. But what they really wanted was power. The power to disrupt, to displace, to own people who had already made that house a home. They wanted to erase the kindness of their mother. To sell something sacred for profit. And I couldn't let that happen. Because I knew what it meant to grow up moving house to house. To never feel settled. To hold your breath every time a lease came up. To hear your parents whispering behind doors trying to hide their panic. Claire's kids deserved better. He did too. So I helped her take it back. We didn't just reverse a sale. We reversed a narrative. We turned a story of helpless tenants into one of grit and justice and glorious revenge. We reminded them and ourselves that not everything is for sale. That some things are earned and fought for and protected at all costs. And sometimes, the good guys win. Not because the world is fair, but because we made it fair. That moment, the day the papers were signed, the deed transferred, I swear I felt the world shift just slightly. As if some balance had been restored. As if Margaret, the original owner, was watching somewhere with a knowing smile saying, "Good. That's how you do it." And I like to think we honored her. We didn't take advantage of her memory. We protected it. We lived up to it. Because she believed in people. And so did we. Every now and then Claire brings up that time. Usually after a glass of wine with a grin. Remember the ammonia by the door? Remember the biker barbecue? Remember when you called me a tenant with teeth? We laugh until we cry. But there's something behind that laughter now. Something solid. A shared sense of victory, of history, of earned peace. Because they still live in that house. They raised all 5 kids there. They had birthdays, holidays, tears, reunions, game nights, new jobs, first loves. All under the same roof. Not a rental. Not a temporary arrangement. A home. And I got to help make that happen. That's something I'll carry with me forever. So no, I'm not a warrior by trade. But just once when it counted, I went to war. And we won. Beautifully. Boldly. And best of all, permanently.